to a very dry and soon-to-be wet Saturday in York for our massive LNER takeover day at Festival Ideas. LNER are very, very happy to be sponsoring today, and we have 3 panel sessions taking place today, so I'm sure all of you are going to be buckled up for the next 6 hours or so. So our first panel session today is looking at transforming York's rail legacy. And we're delighted to be joined today by 3 expert panellists, and we'll give them all a chance to introduce themselves in a moment. We are being broadcast today on YouTube for you all to catch up afterwards. So we'll have a quick summary of why York's rail heritage is being transformed by each of the panellists. We'll then have a short discussion, and then it'll be over to all of you for about 20 to 30 minutes of questions. So please do get thinking now. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Steve Davies, MBE, Dr. Suzanne Major, and also Mary-Anne Slater, each bringing their own expert knowledge. And more, we're looking at more than just the engines and the buildings. We're looking at the human stories that woven in throughout this as well. So I'm going to ask each of our panellists to introduce themselves, and then we'll kick off with your short presentations.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I wouldn't say expert, I'd say enthusiast. We'll see. You can be the judges afterwards. My name's Steve Davies. 33 years in the army. I finished as a full colonel. My last but one job was in Sierra Leone as military advisor to the president. While I was there, I set up the Sierra Leone National Railway Museum, as one does, and that is absolutely and utterly thriving, and I'm continue to be made very heavily involved with it, hence the badge. That got me noticed in the UK, having gone to be chief of staff of a division in Edinburgh for a few years. I got a job offer to run the Museum of Science and Industry in Manchester, and then very quickly from there moved to York to be the director of the National Railway Museum. I think my crowning glory was getting all 6 A4 class Pacifics together, which many of you, I hope, enjoyed. And I shall go to my grave with 6 A4s carved onto my gravestone. I'm now the Managing Director of the International Railway Heritage Consultancy Limited. We've got contracts all around the world. And one of the key jobs we're doing at the moment is building and operating the replica 1825 train, which will operate on the main line this September. And there will be an image of that will be a backcloth to my speech. So if you want to expand on that later, delighted to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Susan.
Oh, hello. I'm Susan Major. I decided when I retired, which is getting on for 20 years ago now, to do a research degree. And I chose railway studies here at York, and I'm now a railway historian. My particular interest is actually the social history of railways, not the locomotives or the technology, but how people use the railways. And I found that there was not much around about how ordinary people used it to extend their mobility. Having produced a book about early railway excursions here, I then did some research based on the Railway Museum's oral history archive, where I looked at the interviews that female railway workers in World War II had been carrying out. And that was really interesting again, because there wasn't much about that. There was a lot of stuff about women working in the land army and the services and the factories, munitions, but not on the railways. So my second book was published subsequently. I'm pleased to say that my first book is now available in Japan because it's been translated into Japanese. So I think that's mainly what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Mary-Anne.
Hi, yes, I'm Mary-Anne Slater. I'm a project manager at York Archaeology. I'm definitely not an expert on railways or trains, but I've been overseeing the archaeological monitoring at York Station Gateway for the last, goodness, now probably like 3, 4, 5 maybe years. So I've been I'm bringing more to the side of how the railway actually transformed the topography and landscape of York, and how it relates to helping us understand York's heritage and its story through the archaeological discoveries actually that the train station and the railways made. So I've been doing that, and I've been a project manager at York for about 6 years now. So just a slightly different side to the story than just the trains.
Thank you. And I realised in the excitement to get started, I didn't actually tell you who I was. My name's Jake Orros, and I work for LNER as their Community Partnership Manager. I look after everything from scout groups visiting train stations to looking after flower beds and other work we do with charities and civic society like the Festival of Ideas. I'm a historian at heart, having completed a Master's in Contemporary British History just a few years ago, so it's nice to be back at a university. So we're going to kick off now with the first summary of knowledge from Steve. So I'll hand over to you.
Okay, well, what I'm going to do is let's focus in on the exam question and what did the railways do for York, and in particular, Yorkshire. Since we're celebrating Railway 200, it's probably a good time to remember that the railways go back well before 1825, and that Yorkshire has had a major input to the earliest days of railway development. In fact, the very first Railway Act of Parliament was passed in 1758 for the Middleton Railway in Leeds. The very first public railway, as we would understand it, i.e. that is built and maintained by a company with publicly traded shares to specifically build and maintain a railway, that was the Lake Lock Railroad, yes, of 1798 near Wakefield. It was open to any user upon payment of a toll. Now, the first commercial use of a locomotive was again in Yorkshire and again in Leeds at the Middleton Railway in 1812 by John Blenkinsop. And Blenkinsop's locomotives were built for service in England and Wales, as well as in Belgium and Poland, with a model of his engines being sent to Russia. Now, the first mainline railway to be operated without recourse to stationary engines was built between Leeds and Selby in 1834, incidentally also home to some of the earliest railway architecture dating from 1834 to 1835. The first standard gauge preserved railway was also in Yorkshire, again in Leeds and again at the Middleton Railway in 1959, when students from Leeds University Union Railway Society preserved the Middleton Railway and ran it with volunteers, at first as a commercial venture. But what of York? Well, York came to the railway scene rather late, in 1839, 9 years after the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. And given the pace of development of railways at that time, 9 years was a long time. This was thanks to the ambitions of two men, George Stephenson and the famous or infamous George Hudson. Now, George Stephenson, the erstwhile father of the railways, had a vision of a railway stretching from the Thames to the Tyne, whilst Hudson, a York lad who became Lord Mayor of York, equally had a vision of a national network, but under his direct control, of course. The first railway to York was the York and North Midland Railway, which was engineered by Stephenson under the chairmanship of Hudson. It ran from Normanton, just outside Wakefield, to York. Now, at Normanton, it connected with Hudson's North Midland Railway, another Stephenson engineering venture, which ran from Leeds to Derby, and the Manchester and Leeds Railway, which latterly became the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, which was another Stephenson line. I hope you're keeping up. Despite the obvious advantages of Leeds as the nodal point for railways in Yorkshire, Hudson effectively bypassed the city in favour of York, with Leeds being on the end, in effect, of a branch line from Normanton. Now, in 1840, York became connected to London. Trains could now run via most of what is today the Midland Main Line from London Euston, where it had running powers over the London North Western Railway, and it went via Rugby. At that point, things were handed over to the Hudson and thence to York. York Station wasn't destined to be a terminus for long. As part of Stephenson's vision to link the Thames and Tyne, what emerged as the York, Newcastle and Berwick Railway, another one engineered by Stephenson, meant that from 1848, when the Newcastle High Level Bridge opened,
trains could run between London, York, Edinburgh, and Newcastle. York, as the Romans discovered, and stagecoach operators too, was a convenient halfway point on the journey to allow passengers to take some refreshment, and because of the relatively small size of the engines and their limited coal and water supply, to change engines, just as horses would be changed on the stagecoaches. Thus, York became a major railway centre, but rather than building locomotives, it became one which serviced the railway. York became a major carriage and wagon building centre, and eventually boasted 2 steam sheds, York North and York South. York would be on the Midland Main Line until the opening of the East Coast Main Line by the Great Northern Railway from London King's Cross to just north of Doncaster in 1850. Now, Hudson did his best to block the new interloper, fearing it would take trade away from his rather circuitous Midland route. Now, the Great Northern was a faster, flatter, more direct route, and by the 1850s, there were 13 trains a day between the two cities, carrying about 13,000 passengers a day. That's a significant number at that time. And it wasn't just one-way traffic. So what was the influence on York? Well, by 1830, York was a city in decline. But by 1850, it was thriving and rich. The railways coming to York stimulated existing businesses and led to new ones developing, particularly in servicing the railway, engine sheds, carriage works, etc., as well as supplying the cloth and timber used to build carriages and wagons. York was the headquarters of the North Eastern Railway, which was formed in 1854, with the present palatial suite of offices, now a hotel, being completed in 1906. Now, the railways allowed different types of food to get to York, including fresh fish from the Yorkshire coast. But it also brought chocolate, sugar, milk, and fruit, which meant York became synonymous with confectionery, especially chocolate. The Quaker chocolate makers, Rowntree and Terry's, were able to send their products not just around Britain, but around the world. And we have the railways to thank for the humble chocolate orange. Now, York had its own carriage and wagon works, which covered 45 acres and employed over 2,000 staff. And the carriage works gave new employment opportunities to women, as more than half the workforce were female. Tourism flourished, with excursions being run into the city from the 1840s. The Leeds and Selby had run excursions from Leeds to York using intermodal travel in the 1830s. Passengers took a train to Selby and then a railway-owned steamboat to York. The railways, for good or bad, made York the tourist hotspot it is today and helped to create its blossoming cultural scene of museums, art galleries, theatres and exhibitions. But what about the post-war period and York today? Well, under the grouping of 1923, York lost its status as HQ of a national railway company and was relegated to regional HQ of the LNER and later British Railways. However, York continued to be a major railway centre. A diesel depot was built in the 1960s, and the carriage and wagon works continued to build, repair and maintain rolling stock, a tradition still upheld by the Siemens Train Maintenance Depot to this day. From its position on the East Coast Main Line, York was frequented by the famous Deltic locomotives, although none were ever stabled here. Now, the East Coast Main Line was electrified, including York, from 1985 to 1991. This was more than 50 years later than when the Great Northern Railway and the North Eastern Railways had envisaged such a project after World War I, when they also proposed electrifying the East Coast route. Interestingly, Oliver Berry, chairman of the Great Northern, stated that Sir Nigel Gresley's famous Pacifics, like Flying Scotsman and Mallard, were simply a stopgap until the wires went up. York was home to the first railway museum in the UK, established by the LNER in 1925, which used as its basis a collection of railway vehicles and artefacts amassed by the North Eastern during previous years. In 1975, together with the Clapham Transport Museum, it formed the nucleus of the national collection of the new National Railway Museum, which opened that year. Now, the NRM was the first national museum to open outside of London. Its home was the old York North steam shed, which closed in 1967, and the NRM, as a former director, I'm proud to say, is the largest and finest museum of its type in Europe. York today is home to the York Rail Operating Centre, which controls all the signalling area in the North East, including the East Coast Main Line from London to the Scottish borders. Train maintenance still takes place, and York is also home to Network Rail's York Campus, a state-of-the-art training and development centre, part of the York ROC. York is not only a railway city because, I quote, George Hudson said all the trains must come to York, but because of their influence on the city and its people. They provided new food, new sources of employment, new sources of wealth, and new sources of recreation. Without the railways, York would not be the vibrant, flourishing, creative city it is today. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. That was an amazing summary of the last, several hundred years. So we're now going to pass over to Susan, who's going to come up and I think you're going to share some slides as well.
That was a wonderfully clear exposition by Steve of how the railways have developed in York and the impact on York over the last 200 years. That's brilliant. I'm now going to home back in on a point. Sorry, I should... There, right. On a point in 1844, when things started to change, you may think that, you will know that York is a big tourist attraction now. There's something like 9 million people visit York every year. But it all started back in 1844, and I wanted to say something about that. My research on this started a few years back when a York man, John Bibby, who sadly we lost just recently, organised an event called 1844 and All That, because what he was saying is that decade was a pivotal decade for York. In 1844, there was the meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science in September, and it was a really important scientific meeting when people came to York and discussed scientific endeavours. It also attracted lots of photographers, and that was an important thing for York at that point. It was the year that the Laycock report on cholera in York was published, which was talking about public health implications. So there was a lot going on in that decade. But what I'm hoping to do very briefly is say how that year masses of people arrived in York for the first time, something you wouldn't actually imagine. This was at a time when huge crowds were very worrying because of Chartism, and there was a feeling that if you got lots of ordinary people together, they would riot. And of course, for the first time, you literally got thousands of people arriving in York. We're talking about the vast majority of people in this country when we talk about the working classes. Most people were working class. Very few were actually middle or upper class travellers, of whom you know quite a lot because they wrote a lot about their travels. But ordinary people, in terms of their leisure, they were working 6 days a week. They had Sundays off. Sabbatarians didn't really like them going or doing anything on a Sunday, so it was actually very difficult to do anything to get around for leisure. You may be aware that people walked long distances when they weren't working. In Lancashire, people would think nothing of walking 30 miles to the coast to places like Blackpool, or if they were lucky, they'd be able to get a lift on a cart. So that was the extent of mobility for leisure for ordinary people. And this is why this thing that happened in 1844, where all the railway links came about, was so important. This, if you can see it, is a chart, and I think it's quite stunning. It shows the changes over a few decades of what was happening with railways at that period. As you can see, 1840, there was a few important links, but then over the next few decades, the railway lines threaded the way across the country. Not so good if you lived in Wales or Scotland or even Devon and Cornwall, but you can see, and then by 1870, there was this massive railway line, so it was able to bring about this sense of connectedness, and these people started to use it. And interestingly, you could compare it with the development of budget flights in the 1990s. People suddenly realised for not very much money they could get around. So it's similar to that. Steve's very kindly summarised this one, which is very useful. York was at the centre. People could go north, they could go east-west, they could go south. So it was very conveniently a place where people could reach from all the big places in the north and the Midlands. And this is where they would arrive, the old station, which I suspect Mary-Anne will be able to tell you something about as well. As I'm sure you know, it was inside the walls, and it had one platform for arrivals and one for departures. They punched a hole in the wall, which is surprising. You know, you wouldn't do that now, but it happened. So that was where people arrived. And it's important to know that we didn't have Lendal Bridge at that point in 1844. There was only one bridge over the river. That was the Hughes Bridge. Sometimes some of the accounts of people's excursions mention them using they might be able to get a ferry to get over the river. But obviously they had to make the way from that old station to the various attractions on their excursions. And I'll mention those later. What was shaping this burst of travel? There were various things. I'd mentioned Sabbatarians. That was a real problem because some companies would run Sunday trips and others wouldn't. So that shaped the availability. In 1842, the Railway Clearing House opened, and that was enabled railway companies to account for the through booking of different of passengers across different companies. So that was jolly useful. Excursions at this point were nothing to do with Thomas Cook. I think and they were quite different. When you look at railway programmes, you quite often get this image of Michael Portillo sitting in a carriage with his Bradshaw very tidily, and I'll say something about conditions in a minute. There was also Gladstone's Railway Act in 1844, where the government was keen to try and make third-class carriages more comfortable and reduce the use of open carriages and trucks. Now, that didn't necessarily work for excursions, because quite often railway companies would use open trucks, a truck that had carried animals or stone to the quarry during the week and then was bunged full of literally thousands of travellers the weekend or on a holiday period. There were other issues to do with safety. They ended up using huge trains, 60 to 80 carriages, sometimes pulled by several locomotives, and there were lots of reports of nasty accidents because there would be broken couplings and the signalling was very basic. And it was debatable whether it was safer to have one long train with up to, say, or over 100 carriages pulled by several engines, or to split it up into have several trains following each other. And it was pretty unsafe, but people so enjoyed the idea of moving around the country for leisure, and it was cheap, a few shillings, and I say it didn't take very long compared to walking, but it did sometimes, because what would happen is these excursion trains would have to give way to other trains. So quite often it took literally hours and hours to get to the destination. And there's lots of reports of people arriving back to where they'd come from in the small hours of the morning. And this might have been, small hours of the morning. They were due to be back at work. So it wasn't easy. And it was very uncomfortable. There were no toilets, no lighting, no heating. Even when they got to York, there were no toilets. So goodness knows how they managed. It was all, the press supported all of this because it was regarded as rational recreation, like libraries and baths, unlike gambling and drinking. a load of stuff on it. This is just a brief overview of August and September 1844, where you've got lots of organisations, Sunday schools, mechanics institutes, local colleges, organising these monster trains to come to York. In August and September, I calculated press reports of something like 25,000 day passengers to York. The population of York at this time was 30,000. And it's interesting that these days we tend to moan about all these people arriving. You know, we complain that there's too many people in York. People welcomed them because it was a spectacle. People stood on the walls and cheered when they arrived because they'd never seen anything like this before. And I suppose they thought of it as an economic idea as well. But yes, they were certainly welcome. But this just gives you an idea of literally how many people were arriving in this space of time. It was regarded as a spectacle, and people talked about monster trains, and you've got this cartoon of a monster train, a vertebrated arc. And the commentators referred to all this as a marvel from the Arabian Nights. It was so special. Because people were quite often carried in open trucks, when people were looking at them from the walls, the people on the walls would bleat and moo at them, and the passengers would return that. It's arguable as to whether it was more comfortable to be in an open truck compared to a third-class carriage, which might have probably have had tiny windows high up, very dark, no lights, unventilated. So people didn't mind the trucks. Oops. Don't know. That stopped moving forward. Attractions, what do they... Oh, there we are, yeah. Attractions, what did they come to see? And some of these are predictable, some not. The Minster, the Walls, of course. Some of these attractions had been completed in the 1830s, such as the Yorkshire Museum and the Gardens. There were lots of people wanting to see the gardens. At one point, there was a menagerie in there, but they had a problem with an escaped bear, so they had to close it. St Mary's Abbey, the Assembly Rooms, Clifford's Tower, the Manor Yard, they tended to go in places like King's Manor Yard, where there was now an asylum for the blind, and they had their lunch in there. But there were two other attractions on the list that you may not predict. One was York Cemetery. Why did they go to York Cemetery? Well, these are people who've come from big cities where all the land has been built over, parks aren't there, nowhere for them to enjoy space. And the York Cemetery, which had opened in the 1830s, had beautiful gardens. And it was about a 15-minute walk from Clifford's Tower, so they went to that. They also sometimes went to Severus Hill in Holgate, which was a bit further, and they had a beautiful view over the centre of York and the Minster. So those are two things that they enjoyed. So I think I'd better shut up there. Oh, sorry, the other thing they did go and see sometimes is the hangings. They would have an excursion to a hanging in York. But there weren't any in 1844 that I've been able to find. So that's probably it. If you want to find out more, I've written about it a couple of times, one in the York Historian and the one in the North Eastern Express, the Journal of the North Eastern Railway Association. So you can find out more there. So thank you very much.
And thank you. I dare I say has much changed when it comes to transporting Catalan commuters today. But Mary-Anne, over to you.
Yes, well, as I said, I'll sort of be doing a slightly different aspect to the talk today. So rather than talking about sort of the railway itself, I'm going to be talking about the effect it had on the city of York, like the landscape and topography, as well as our understanding of the heritage of York. So, as well as creating a huge transformation in York, the arrival of the railway in 1839 also played an important role in altering the landscape of the southwest corner of the city, and it was pivotal in finding some major archaeological discoveries that have contributed to our knowledge of York's heritage. The construction of the railway lines and associated buildings dramatically altered the character of this part of York. Huge excavations and ground clearance was undertaken both inside and outside of the city walls changing the topographical landscape from a ridged spur of higher ground to one suitable for a railway. Land south of Lehman Road was levelled and the natural valley through the area, which a stream flowed, was infilled. A temporary wooden station was built outside the city walls on Queen Street in 1839, which was succeeded in 1841 by the station inside the walls, now known as the Old Railway Station. This was at the junction of what is now Toff Green, Tanner Row and Station Rise. Two massive arches were punched through the city walls to the north of Toft Tower to allow trains through to the railway station inside. Associated infrastructure, such as coal depots, engine sheds and workshops, were also constructed. Due to the city walls, it was necessary for the trains to reverse out of the city, which meant limited capacity for the station, as there were only the two train arches through the city walls. Therefore, in 1877, the present railway station was constructed immediately outside of the city walls. Oh, sorry, missed that one. It's the view of the old station, which we'd always say had from Susan. But that's just two views there, so you can see the old station, views from the city walls. So you can see, yeah, just the two lines, the two platforms, one in and one out. And there's the arches. Sorry, I was a bit too eager there. Forgot about that. So then we can see here how it's changed with the new station now on the outside. So yeah, it was constructed immediately outside of the city walls, along with a new road network which included Rougier Street and Lendal Bridge. Industrial expansion continued along Holgate and Lehman Roads, including terraced housing for all of the railway workers. The construction of the old railway station played a vital part in the story of our understanding of Roman York. While building the station in the Toff Green area, work revealed the structural remains of a complex of Roman public baths. Individual elements included a rectangular room with apsidal end, a suite of 5 or more rooms including plunge baths and a furnace flanked by pillars. Other discoveries included a Roman mosaic pavement discovered during revetment work on Toff Green in 1840, along with the thick wall foundations of another apse building. This mosaic that you can see here now is in the Yorkshire Museum, and it shows a bull with a fish tail, of course, as you do. So during the construction of the old and present railway stations, the Royal Station Hotel and associated railway buildings, a Roman cemetery was discovered. So Romans did not bury their dead within the towns. They always liked to build them on the outskirts. And Roman cemeteries are usually found along the roads extending away from their settlements. The cemetery was extensive and contained both inhumations and cremations, dating from around the 2nd century through to the 4th century. So the material and information that we currently have about this Roman cemetery is almost all derived from the railway works of the 19th century. So archaeological work in this part of York is still continues to demonstrate the scale of engineering and alteration that the railways caused. In some areas, we've been finding thick 2-metre deep deposits of 19th century made ground, whereas other areas have been totally scalped by the Victorian landscaping, resulting in Roman burials being less than 1 metre below current ground level. The majority of the archaeological deposits and activity uncovered so far during archaeological monitoring at our work at York Station Gateway date to the existing railway station, which opened in 1877, or the earlier iteration in 1841. Several brick structures and foundations have been uncovered relating to the industrial history of the site. So we've got this large brick surface constructed from scoria bricks, and that was covered just beyond the long-stay car park barriers. Scoria bricks were an innovative Victorian solution to recycling. The silvery blue bricks were made from molten runoff or slag from the blast furnaces of the industrial northeast in the late 19th century. These bricks were used in the approach to the 1877 railway station, and they were also in early 20th century repairs to the engine shed, and they've also seen in back alleyways and gutters all around York. Several other surfaces and structures have also been found during these works. We've found this stone flag floor, possibly dating to the earlier 1841 railway station, but all our current evidence suggests that the excavation area has really been heavily disturbed by this industrial activity relating to the two stations. Earlier archaeological deposits that we do have still in this part of part of York, were found again in the long-stay car park by the current station. We had a pair of large ditches dating to the medieval period. The first was a large ditch running north-south through the centre of the site, and it was about 1/2 metre deep and 1.5 metres wide that we still had present. It had been truncated by a later 19th century drain, and the full width of the ditch probably is estimated at being about 2 to 3 metres wide, so it would have been quite a sizable boundary ditch. It was found to be full of medieval green glazed pottery and animal bone dating to the 13th and 14th centuries, suggesting it was used for rubbish dumping, probably from the nearby medieval city. The second ditch ran east-west across the site and again was along the western edge of the long-stay car park. This was recorded, what we had of it was recorded at over 2 metres wide and again about 1/2 metre deep. So I don't know how well you can see it there. I don't know if I have a pointer on this. It's just coming in down there. You can see that dark cut and then it goes along here. And then we've just got it, it's been truncated here by later activity. So again, yeah, that's been truncated by later activity above and also by a later gas pipe to the south. Same as the other ditch, it contained 13th and 14th century pottery and some animal bone. It may have been connected with the earlier ditch to create a series of medieval field boundaries relating to agricultural activity on the site during this period. Previous work that we've undertaken at the station during the course of all the works that have been going on over the last sort of 3-4 years. We've recovered undisturbed Roman burials relating to that Roman cemetery that I mentioned earlier. We've also had disarticulated or disturbed human bone, which has also been recovered, which mostly came from a thick layer of the post-Roman plough soil. You can see it's this sort of thick build up here, sort of again relating to when it was an agricultural site and nothing was really happening in the area during that period. The construction of the railway stations required large-scale landscaping of the area, which resulted in some areas of the Roman cemetery surviving at really shallow depths. So in some cases, we've taken the road surface off, we've taken a little bit of the hardcore, and we're straight onto natural sort of sandy gravel geology, and there's a Roman burial. So we might be talking as shallow as 50 centimetres below the current ground. Well, as I said, other areas have been highly disturbed by 19th century activity, and then we might have like sort of 2 metres of build-up of sort of 19th century made ground. So we're still monitoring work at the York Station Gateway, and we're sort of getting to the final stages of it now. We've seen the demolition of the Queen Street Bridge, which was very interesting, having to work during that. It was over a weekend and overnight, so trying to monitor work overnight and trying to see the subtle changes in soil colours when it's night time and you're under under fluorescent lights is a bit tricky. And we've also seen the opening up of the space now between the station and the city walls. During the course of the project, York Archaeology has undertaken numerous test pits and borehole investigations, as well as monitoring the construction works to ensure that any archaeological deposits disturbed are excavated and recorded fully before work continues. We haven't just been monitoring the below-ground archaeology, though. We've also undertaken historic building recording on the Queen Street Bridge prior to its demolition, and also the Railway Institute Gymnasium building adjacent to the railway station. This has helped us create a written and photographic record of the structures prior to the demolition or alteration. So as I said, we've also had the challenge of undertaking night work. So we did the demolition of the Queen Street Bridge last year, and then also recently, I think the late May Bank holiday weekend when the road was closed, we were there monitoring at night while they were taking up the temporary road and putting in the new road back in. So again, quite a challenge trying to work at night. So as you can see, the legacy of the railway in transforming the topography and character of York, as well as its importance in the discovery of York's heritage, still continues to this day. Development work relating to the railway continues to expose more of York's fascinating story from the modern period, but all the way back to the Roman. Thank you.
So we're now going to have a brief panel discussion before we open up to questions from the audience. So my first question, Susan, how important were the railways in shaping social mobility and that change in class structure, particularly in the 1840s, but even right through to today.
Tremendously important. As I pointed out, people were suddenly able to get around, which meant they could go and visit new places and see exciting scientific discoveries in another big city. And it also changed people's perceptions of the working classes, because until then, other classes had worried about being near large groups of working class people because they thought they were a bit dangerous. But things like the Great Exhibition of 1851 proved that actually they could behave themselves. So that was quite important. So it did change people's perceptions. And it also meant that ordinary people could get around and see these new landscapes, these new investigations, these new discoveries that they hadn't seen before, all because they could reach places very quickly by train, York, and do all sorts of interesting things.
Brilliant. Mary-Anne, a question about the impact of infrastructure projects. Perhaps the Victorians hadn't paid as much close care to what they were discovering, but how important are large infrastructure projects like the Gateway Project or HS2, Crossrail, etc., in actually unlocking the past? And would that past be unlocked if it weren't for the infrastructure projects being taken or undertaken?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, yes, actually, just to touch on the Victorians, they were actually very good with their antiquarian records. So we do actually have good records, for the time of the discoveries that they made. We don't often know exactly maybe where they were found, but we know rough areas and what they found. So they weren't too bad. But yes, major infrastructure works now really do have a big part to play in archaeological discovery still. I mean, you sort of think how much left can there still be to find, but with HS2, York Station Gateway, other like gas pipelines, we're always finding archaeological sites. Especially like HS2, we've had some really massive sites along those, big cemeteries or big settlements, which wouldn't have been discovered had these works not been undertaken.
We talked about the Victorians protecting their environment, but there were times when they wanted to get rid of the walls, so they didn't always protect it.
And I must say, LNER's office is actually now, our head office is now back in the original station, within the walls, within the City Council's refurbished offices, and it's absolutely stunning how we've been able to repurpose that heritage. And so, Steve, just wanting to pick out, you spoke about so much, but particularly about National Railway Museum this year in their 50th anniversary year. How important is the education of the next generation in railway heritage to understand where we should be going?
Well, it's critically important, but from numerous angles. First and foremost is instilling in the new generation pride in what this country has achieved and what we've gifted to the world over the years. And I'm not ashamed to be proud of Britain and what we have done. And we invented the railways, we exported the railways, and we continue to be major partners with international railway bodies. Secondly, and I think in a modern context, there is no doubt that railways and railway history also provide a vehicle, excuse the pun, for promoting engineering. And if anything, this country has to get a lot better at creating an interest in engineering and creating engineers. Because without them, if we aspire to maintain an engineering and an industrial base, then we need them. And railways are a great vehicle. And there is no doubt that if you want to inspire a child or a youth, take the National Railway Museum and just stand there. And apart from the spectacle of the locomotives, which of course are maintained in a condition that they were never in operation. We always think the past was gleaming. It wasn't. I mean, it's a fact that most mainline stations had a nurse in order to allow to get ash out of people's eyes. And if you watch the film Brief Encounter, you'll see that there's an example of that. So there was a platform nurse. So the railways were dirty, and we present the railways in the museum in almost preserved in aspect, an idealised way. Having said which, the railways had access to significant numbers of cheap labour to keep everything clean, which obviously is not today. So pride in our history, pride in using the railway industrial heritage as a vehicle for promoting engineering, but also promoting railways, and this is the third point, and most importantly, promoting railways as the most environmentally efficient way of moving people around the country over any distance. The lack of, or the absolute minimum degree of friction with a steel wheel on a steel rail compared to rubber on tarmac with small numbers, and I'm not being flippant here, folks. That is, it's a scientific fact that is the most efficient way to do it, and we should be promoting railways as a form of transport. Clearly, Mr. Beeching took an axe to lots of our lines, and that's quite a controversial subject. I'm not entirely sure he got it totally wrong. But using the Railway Museum as what I call neutral space for debate is an important one. The great thing for the railway companies is that everyone who visits the Railway Museum, there's a captive audience there of people who have voluntarily gone there. And it's a great way to get feedback from what you're trying to do. Does that answer your question?
Oh, definitely. And we'll stick with you for a minute, Steve. So one of the things I find fascinating is, of course, this year we're celebrating 200 years of the modern railway, I must say. And there is a replica of Locomotion, which has the irony of being one of the newest built locomotives, engines, railway vehicles in the country, in the world, in fact, is actually a replica of Locomotion. Do you want to tell us more about the process of getting that on the rails?
Well, wearing one hat I wear is I'm chairman of the A1 Steam Locomotive Trust. And I'm slightly distracted at the moment, folks, because I know that Tornado is currently going over Shap. So if my brain's elsewhere, having said which, I'd rather be here with you great people. So that's a brand new engine. That sets the tone for what we're just doing at the moment. My company is project managing the creation of the replica 1825 train. And this is going to be a centrepiece to this September's bicentenary celebrations. So we have taken and you saw the photograph, we've taken the 1975 replica. Ownership was transferred from Beamish to Darlington Council. Darlington Council have pumped in significant amounts of money. And the locomotives had a major overhaul, including improvements to it, because it didn't have, at Beamish it would probably do a few hundred yards and then run out of steam. I've got to get this thing to do 28 miles and keep going, and we've managed to do that. We've also built, though, a brand new train. So there you saw 3 children wagons and a replica of Experiment, which was the director's coach for the Stockton and Darlington Railway directors. Now, although it looked 1825, hidden in its exterior is roller bearings, brand new axles and wheels based on the original pattern, fully air braked throughout, P1 profile for the tyres, ORR Network Rail heavily involved in certifying this thing. And on the 26th of September, the train will travel on the main line from Shildon to Darlington, and that recreates the fact that the directors did a tour of the railway the day before the opening. On the 27th of September, the train will go over Skerne Bridge to much fanfare, and we'll probably reverse and do quite a few things with people in top hats and all that kind of business in the back. And then at midnight on the 27th, it will go up to the East Coast Main Line, North Junction, which is just north of Banktop Station. We sit there, we wait for the signal, and someone to tell us that the overhead electricity has been turned off. We're not moving unless that happens. The chimney won't touch, but we then steam into Banktop Station for a major photo opportunity and so on. And the objective is for David Horn to get his money shot, which is that train parked next to one of these things in the station. But it's not over at that point, folks. We then carry on at about 2 in the morning to Dinsdale, go to Eaglescliffe Junction, sit there for the rest of the night, and at the appropriate moment on the 28th, we then steam into Stockton Station, for a triumphal arrival. Included in that triumphal arrival will be the Royal Artillery, firing the few artillery pieces we haven't given to the Ukrainians, to replicate the fact that there was a 21-gun salute back in 1825. So it's an ambitious project, but I'm delighted to say that so many key components of the railway industry, Network Rail, ORR, Ricardo, who do all the certification work, and LNER, David's taken a fantastic interest in this because this is part of your heritage, have all come together to make the crazy work.
And I think on that, and we'll bring the others in a second, it is just on how important the media machine, marketing, thinking about leisure excursions or talking about the discoveries made in infrastructure projects, how important marketing has always been to the railway industry, whether that be romanticised travel posters, or even thinking back to one of the replicas from the 30s in National Railway Museum of rockets with carriages when we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. So perhaps, Susan, how important were the marketing pieces in actually encouraging people to travel on this newfangled steel highway?
Well, in my case, they didn't have to do much in the way of marketing, and of course it would have been very plain letterpress handbills stuck on a wall, because there's word of mouth. There were so many people so keen to use these excursion trains, they didn't have to try very hard. And of course, it wasn't until much later that you got these wonderful full-colour excursion posters, but that wasn't my period. But one thing I was going to say, to sort of interrupt slightly, in terms of LNER and modern tourism trends, is that I think there's an opportunity for you to engage, because there's a feeling now amongst lots of people, they no longer want to fly. They want to use the trains, etc. And so there's all sorts of opportunities there. From York, you can be anywhere in the world. We've just come back from a train trip to Corsica, albeit with a bit of ferry as well. But, you can go anywhere in the world on the train. And so I think it's important to remember that.
And I think one of the key points there, having travelled via ferry, is how encompassing the railways actually became, running hotels, ferries and everything else in between.
Indeed. I mean, obviously the hotels and the ferries, and then that they had to sell those off. But there's all sorts of opportunity for the different elements of this to get together and say, why fly when you think of all the disadvantages of flying, apart from the environmental side of it, the fact that you've got to go to an airport, you've got to wait around for a long time, you've got to go through all these security checks, and people, at least you can walk around on a train.
Of course. And you get stunning views like this,
yes.
Looking out to the North Sea. And Mary-Anne, something that's been on my mind since your slides, do you have a star object for what has been discovered or unlocked by the railway?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, sort of talking overall, I think some of the really interesting things that have come out have been at the Roman buildings from when the old station was constructed inside the wall. So we've got obviously the mosaic that I showed. And we've got these big bath complexes of buildings. We've got sort of inscription dedication stones in the buildings. I just think all of these things wouldn't have been discovered had it not been for the construction of the railways and the stations. And they would, obviously potentially still be under there waiting to be discovered. So I think for me it's the structures. But then there's also, we've got this extensive Roman cemetery, and we've got some of the antiquarian records from the time which detail that they found inhumation burials, and there was like the personal effects and the grave goods that people were buried with. So you might have like little glass jars. I think some had little spoons or personal toiletry sets. I think that just adds a really nice personal story to it, rather than, someone was buried, but we're also finding out a little bit more maybe about them and either what they liked or what was important potentially to them. So I think that side of the stories is quite nice, getting those personal stories as well. And
what do you think the Romans would make of the railway? Do you think they'd be mass spreaders of railway technology to support Roman Empire and legions in Britain?
I think they probably would, yes. I think they would have seen it as quite a nice means of conquering more places.
Or perhaps supporting a growing Roman leisure and tourism market.
It's definitely that, and also getting transporting all their crops and produce all back to the military. So, yeah.
We're now reaching a point where we're going to hand over to the audience. So I hope you have your long list of questions for all of our panellists.
Thanks very much. I think this might be for Susan, but one of the impacts of the railways coming to York, of course, was demographic. And I think, I haven't looked at it very much, but it looks like, quite a number of people migrated to York to work on the railways. And I don't know whether from your Clementhorpe experience, is that the case? I mean, or did most people who were in York already working on the railways, or was it actually importing people?
I haven't done much in the way of specific research on that, but I'm aware that in particular people like the engine drivers tend to come from the northeast, and there were lots of other people who would have migrated from other parts of Yorkshire, but I couldn't be more specific about that.
And I think what's fascinating just on that movement of people piece and migration is perhaps the impact railways have had on individuals like me who are able to commute to York from London on a daily basis to work, and to think before the railways I would have actually had to physically live in York to work at our head office within the old station. So I think that day commuter movement is fascinating by rail as well. I think we had another question on this side. Yes, the man in the blue jumper.
If I could ask Steve about the rebuilding of Locomotion, I just wonder how much of the modern health and safety requirements on trains have to be built in this into the engine to allow it to be run on the main line.
That's a very good question, actually. And we're all treating this as a one-off in order to get around some of those things. You're absolutely right. The driver stood up on a platform, and all the motion's going up and down in front of him. It's like riding a steam-powered four-wheeled Singer sewing machine. It's quite extraordinary. But it's not as dangerous as it looks. And everything, you can risk assess everything. There are sort of rails for the driver now to lean against, which are quite secure. Interestingly, one of the challenges we've had with it has been that whenever you opened the firehole door, burning coal would fall out onto the track. And not surprising, on a heritage railway, and we're currently testing on the Weardale line, it's not a problem on an ash ballast and so on, but Network Rail won't be too chuffed if I, excuse the phrase, put burning coal in the forefoot. So we came up with a very simple bar system to do that, but equally, it does create quite a lot of ash. And the distances we have to cover, we can't do that in one go. So we've created a hopper system that sits underneath. You scrape it out into the hopper, and then when you get a convenient location, you put it off. We've had to make sure that what you don't do is adjust your position. You can't step from the tender onto the engine while it's moving. That's a no-no, because that's just adding a complication. And we've added all sorts of non-slip surfaces as well to it. But we've had Michael Portillo was up there recently. He's always there, isn't he? Phil up there with a guy called Chris Cubitt, who was a driver. Chris, by the way, was a fireman in 1975. Ex-Thornaby mine in the 1960s. Doesn't look old enough to have been around in the 60s. Quite extraordinary. And we've also had Dan Snow up there filming. So they've all wanted something. So we've had two up there, and with some common sense. And I'll be driving it. We're doing 64 miles with it this Monday, by the way. We're doing a very long distance all-day test with it, which will be great fun. So there's a lot of things there that have to be getting in and out of the children wagons, for example. We've had to put steps in and so on. And the coach is a fascinating experience. And, of course, none of these vehicles are sprung. The engine's got slightly springs, but the carriages and the wagons don't have any springs at all. And we had to build into it a rocking arm for one of the axles to sit on so that you always had 4 points of contact. And, again, it's all health and safety. And the key thing is convincing Network Rail two things. A, we're not going to damage their infrastructure.
and B, we're not going to stop and embarrass ourselves. Having said which, they want us to put a diesel in a section ahead of it, be able to rescue it if necessary. And I suspect the diesel will also carry British Transport Police, who will be looking out for the trespassers, because I suspect, and quite a bit of the health and safety side is focused on operating it in the dark. It's one thing driving this thing in daylight with all the rods going up and down. It's quite another thing in daylight. In the dark, I beg your pardon. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I can imagine the complexity of trying to conform with the one health and safety requirements.
Yeah, I mean, it works on the heritage railway. It's fine. The second you go onto the big railway, it's a complete. But we've been at this for 2.5 years now, and ORR appointed an engineer to us at the very beginning of the project to advise on all these issues, so that it didn't come as a surprise to them at the very last minute. I've got lots of video on, as you can imagine, of this. We've filmed it in action, but there's something really satisfying about going out on the line with this thing. And the Weardale, of course, is a Stockton and Darlington railway. And I have come away from this with a newfound respect for the engineers who built the thing in the first place, because it's a challenge with modern methods and materials. It must have been one hell of a challenge to keep these things going, because they weren't engineers, they were effectively blacksmiths, transferring one skill into another. Okay.
One question to Susan. I was interested to know about the these long trains coming from Leeds and Wakefield into York, and how they accommodated 30 and 40 carriages at the old station, because the platform wouldn't have been long enough. And how did they turn 3 engines, if they did turn them? I don't know whether there was a turntable at that time, or how the logistics of accommodating that train and then taking it back must have been somewhat complicated, I should imagine.
It would have been. I mean, that brings about technical details that I have no knowledge of, because you can't get information from the railway companies about excursion trains. They didn't separate them out. One interesting thing about these long trains is sometimes, in general, they would stop on viaducts and people wouldn't realise and they would get out.
Yeah.
So it was very, very dangerous. But yes, I don't know whether Steve would know how they accommodated that turning round, but they were certainly very long trains.
Yeah, with the platform not being long enough, I should imagine, nowhere near the length it needed to be.
I think my instinct is that the train before arrival would have been split, and it had taken one section in, got that emptied, brought it out, and so on. And that given that no one was in a rush, really, that was probably perfectly possible. What is amazing about those trains is the fact that they had few, if any, brakes, and I think the appalling example of what can happen when it goes wrong with a train like that is the Armagh incline disaster, in which a train, they put stones underneath. The Armagh incline disaster was from Armagh train to Newry in Northern Ireland. And when I was commanding my regiment out there, I once deployed a company of soldiers to protect me while I walked the incline, by the way, just to... God bless the British taxpayer, by the way. And a train set off, grossly overloaded. The engine struggled up this incline, and it could see the top. It was about 200 yards from the top, but it ground to a halt. They tried to get it to go, but it didn't. They decided to split the train and take half to the top and half back. There was one handbrake on one vehicle in the second half. So they decided to put some stones under the rails. The other context here is that, of course, all the passengers were locked into the carriages. You could not let yourself out. The front portion set off. But as it set off, rather like setting off on a hill in your car, the train set back slightly. And it pushed the second portion over the stones, and that second portion ran away and gathered speed, and then ran into another train which was coming up the hill behind it, and the whole lot cascaded over the embankment, and the loss of life was appalling. The first half clearly got to the top, but that precipitated a major push to get continuous brakes through. But again, this was effectively an example of an excursion train, grossly overloaded, with the focus on maximum profit, not maximum safety. And it's that swingometer, slowly but surely over the 19th century, went the right way. And companies have got to get in balance. You can't run an unprofitable railway. Well, we do, but you know what I mean. Yeah.
Yes, railway companies didn't necessarily put on any extra staff, despite the fact they were carrying thousands of people. The other problem, safety-wise, is that railway stations were designed for small groups of middle-class people to pass through very orderly. They weren't designed for 1,000 people to arrive for a trip. And quite often the stations would lock their doors, and so you literally got a huge crowd of thousands of people waiting outside the doors, and there are some examples of where, when the doors were open, people were trampled. So there were lots of issues.
And yet people kept coming to the railway.
Yeah, you imagine, there's lots of accounts of people on these excursion trains in an open truck, hours travelling from Newcastle to York in the pouring rain. You can't imagine what it must have been like, but they enjoyed it because it was the only opportunity they had to do this sort of thing. And of course, when they were able to go to London, even though it took hours and hours and hours, they really enjoyed it.
And we're about to come to our next audience question. Yes, there's someone at the back near the camera. And whilst we're waiting for the mic to reach you, Mary-Anne, where can people see some of the objects which have been uncovered by York Archaeology?
I mean, mainly, most of the stuff is in our archive, which is at our offices. But if anyone did want to come and see them, obviously they can request to view the archive. Some of the more of the antiquarian artefacts are in the Yorkshire Museum. So yeah, you can have a look at those there.
Well, I'm certainly going to be putting a request to see that mosaic.
Yeah, yes.
The lady at the back.
Hello. The expansion of the railway network between 1840 and 1870 was absolutely phenomenal. How was it financed?
It was all privately raised, unlike other countries where it might have been government finance. It was privately raised. It's a remarkable achievement. And you can see from the picture, the map, how remarkable it was.
It also resulted in many, many people going bankrupt. The railway mania has parallels with the dot-com boom. Those who got in at the beginning made lots and lots of money. And you see this now, don't you? Then there was a trend. And so people were building railways that weren't needed. And in many respects, Beeching righted some of that imbalance. You know, in some cases, you had towns joined by 3 separate railways, which was grotesquely inefficient. And the railway mania resulted in, if you like, the Wall Street crash of railway construction. And lots of people lost lots of money. As I say, those who got in at the beginning made a lot of money. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway was profitable, significantly profitable from day one. It was the only route between Liverpool and Manchester, apart from the canals. And everybody wanted to use them. But the money supply was drying up. And as has been suggested, many railways actually many countries viewed their railways as state assets almost from the beginning, particularly Prussia, and the German state railways and so on.
Sorry,
yeah.
Can I I was just going to go back to your question about artefacts and Mary-Anne, as you can probably predict what I'm going to say. She mentioned the uncovering of the scoria bricks in front of the station. And if anybody's interested in scoria bricks, it's one of my research interests, and I've just published a paper about them. They are an important feature of York, generally, the back alleys, as some of you will know.
Yes, person at the front.
Just to Susan, I was going to ask, you talked about the expansion of tourism into York. When did that transfer onto the coast, like Scarborough, Whitby, Filey? Because I've seen quite a lot of posters advertising those places, Knaresborough, so sort of getting out onto the seaside and the east coast.
Yes, the line to Scarborough opened in 1845, and to start with, there was a lot of feeling amongst the Scarborough people that they didn't want these hordes coming into Scarborough, so they were worried about it. But yes, seaside trips came up not very long after that. People used to visit Scarborough, Hull, Filey, those sort of places, and the railway was tremendously important for that.
So when did that transfer into holidays then?
Well, yeah. Well, don't forget, people didn't have paid holidays. So that if they were, most of the people I've been talking about would have just had a day off, or perhaps at Whitsun they would have a few days. So if it comes to actually a week's holiday, that's more likely to have been the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, unless they'd got accommodating friends and family, and they could afford to have time off. One of the other aspects that I have written about is sometimes people were able to take Monday trips. And that's because there's this thing called St. Monday, where if you were a skilled craftsman, you could actually take Monday off because your employer didn't have any control over that, but you'd work hard the rest of the week. So railway companies actually organised Monday trips, which is quite an interesting idea.
And was there someone else with a question over here?
Thank you. It's sort of related to a question from back here. I think our country, it was quite piecemeal, the way where the lines were from the beginning. So, you had Darlington and Stockton right at the beginning, and then... So there was a lack of national planning, probably understandably in a way, but I think as a country we probably missed a trick. I don't know if it could be rectified, getting more of a, putting the lines and the stations where they're needed by the most people. Just reminded me about the Leeds-Liverpool canal route. No, we're not talking about canals as such, but it was affected by local industrialists, and it wasn't done in the ideal places. It was done by the people who had the money and said, right, we'll pay extra if you come this way. And I don't know if that was also a case with some of the railway lines and where they were and where they weren't.
Well, all railways had to get an Act of Parliament to be built. So there was a degree of political and national level scrutiny. That wasn't entirely an altruistic process, because in many cases the MPs were also directors of the railways. Parallels? No. And so there was that. Also, railways sometimes could be extremely expensive to construct, particularly if a landowner said, I don't want to see that railway, I want it to go through a tunnel. So pointless tunnels were made in order that the landowner couldn't see the railway. So it went under his land, not over. There's a classic is just between Gisborne and Blackburn. There's a very ornate tunnel in which the castellated ends were there to suit the taste of the landowner, but there was no need for that tunnel. It was just simply to hide the train. So there was a degree of scrutiny, but my instinct is that no one stood back and said, is that really required? And of course, railways did not exist for social purposes. Railways existed purely to make profit for shareholders. That's how business starts. A spin-off of that was social benefit. Now, later on, as railways evolved, and it became realised that there's no such thing as a profitable railway, then people began to realise, actually, the social and economic benefits of railways were worth subsidising. And that's true to this day.
I think we have some questions in the grandstand at the back. And I think it's worth, you raised a good point, bringing up the canals. It's worth thinking that railways weren't the first method of mass movement of goods. But you don't see, unless I'm wrong, you might know otherwise, Susan, about people going on excursions via canal.
No, generally not. Interestingly, there were occasions when Chartist groups tried to organise a canal trip and they were prevented because people didn't want them moving around.
Yeah. At the back, hopefully the mic's with you.
Hi, I was just wondering, with all these different train lines and perhaps the lack of kind of central coordination, how did they prevent them from crashing? Because now you've got a very kind of complex system to make sure that the trains don't crash into each other.
They didn't. It was extremely rudimentary. The railways, at first it was a free-for-all, and you could almost, if you paid the railway, you could operate your own train on the tracks. No one they were going off what's called the time interval process. So the train would set off, and after half an hour, they'd say, right, it must have got there by now. The next one can go. That started to have consequences, as you can imagine, quite frequently. And the public became quite alarmed. Punch magazine was prolific in producing sort of horrifying cartoons showing the consequences of a train journey. And you could, as well as buying a train ticket, at the same time move to another window and buy a life insurance policy. I am not joking. So you could buy a life insurance policy hoping that you would actually not have to draw on it. Eventually, of course, the railways realised we need a degree of order. And so policemen, the peelers, Robert Peel's policemen, were employed to act as some kind of signalling system. And that's why today a signalman on Network Rail is called a bobby. And it harks back to the time of Robert Peel, because policemen, of course, we all call them bobbies. And so it's an interesting one. Then eventually they realised, well, actually, we need something a bit more robust. And the ability to regulate trains was transformed with the introduction of electric telegraph. Because with electric telegraph, you could have a degree of control over trains in sections. Now, that's never infallible. One of the great things about railways, though, as opposed to road transport, is that every accident has resulted in a safer railway. That's true. Because great steps were taken to learn from this. Quite often, though, government struggled to get the private railway companies to invest in the safety measures that were being proposed. And the Midland Railway was resisted hugely some of the technological advances that were being promoted. But it's come at a price, and we've gone completely full circle now. The digital era has utterly transformed signalling. You will now, at the moment, of course, you see signals by the side of the track. They are disappearing. And we're moving towards a thing called European Train Control System, which is a screen in the cab that tells you what the signal aspect is. And Tornado, a brand new steam locomotive, has just been the first steam engine in the world to be fitted with European Train Control System. And the integration of all those electronics into the hostile environment of a steam locomotive with coal, water, steam, sulphur, the glare from the firebox and so on, has been a very interesting exercise. But we were testing it recently on the Cambrian line, which has already got ETCS, and it's worked brilliantly. I think that one of the first stretches to get it will be King's Cross to Peterborough, and then slowly working its way up the East Coast.
Yes, and that's tied in. It's the new signalling system, which I find fascinating. There are parts of the network still using the semaphore signals the Victorians installed, but specifically on that piece between Peterborough and King's Cross, it's unlocked so much more capacity that this December we're going to be rolling out a new timetable, which should work and will mean better, quicker journeys up and down our 900-mile routes for LNER between London, Inverness and Aberdeen. And I think we've got about 7 minutes or so left. So if there are a couple of...
if I just add one point to that, and that is that you're absolutely right. The railway, the pace at which one can invest in a railway and the degrees of priority results in the old and the very old coexisting with the new and the very new. So, for example, we were stationed at Shrewsbury Station to go onto the Cambrian line. And as we left the depots at 1 a.m, we were being signalled under Great Western Railway lower quadrant semaphore signals. And then we reached a point 100 metres further on where we switched to European Train Control System. And then we had to switch back. And I thought, I loved it, by the way. I loved it.
So we'll steam towards our final few questions.
Hello, my name's Kevin Swift. I'm very impressed by LNER's confidence that the December timetable is going to be nice and smooth. But really what I wanted to comment on was the fact that the canals were actually extensively used for leisure trips. I'm thinking in particular of the Leeds-Liverpool canal, whose wiggly line was commented on by somebody else. but that was certainly used to take people from Liverpool to Southport. Again, as the speaker said earlier, quite often you did get a bit of intermodal. In other words, people were at that time quite happy to do 15 miles on a canal barge and then, 4 miles on a coach of some kind. But certainly they were extensively used. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a rejoinder to that, and that is in terms of freight. The Liverpool-Manchester Railway was on a winner because the canals, it cost just as much to get the cotton bales from America to Liverpool as it did to get them from Liverpool to Manchester by canal. And the chances were that 25% of your goods were stolen on that journey. And that's a fact. That's why the railways were in a very good position to compete with canals. Having said which, canals as an industrial, moving industrial, have continued into the 20th, 21st century. Interestingly, why is British Transport Police not called British Railway Police? Because British Transport Police's remit was railways and canals, now just railways. And if you look at their cat badge, you'll see 3 railway wheels and a wiggly water bit. So there's a bit of so they can't be bothered to rebrand, which is interesting.
Thank you. So, gentleman here.
Hello. I'm interested in you talking about new methods of signalling. Do you think we risk losing resilience and redundancy in this? You know, we control everything in York from King's Cross to the Scottish border. If somebody presses the wrong button, or lightning strikes in the wrong place, or some bad actor decides, if I take that out, I stuff the railways. Do you think we are sufficiently conscious of these dangers, and if so, what are we doing about them?
Just a really quick one, and I think it's a really good question. I think it's worth noting that the existing infrastructure also isn't necessarily removed from braking. We've all been stuck on trains when there have been signal failures or issues with track circuits, etc. And so I think the challenges might be different, but we're not moving from a space of no issues with signalling systems to a new system where there won't be any issues either. They'll be slightly different, but railway will still be safe. And I think railway will be a lot safer now compared to how it was maybe in the 1840s.
I think all systems have their challenges, all signalling systems. One of the benefits of ETCS is the removal of all the line-side infrastructure, because so often your journey is disrupted because thieves have stolen the copper cabling and so on and so forth. So that will be removed from their temptation. There is undoubtedly challenges and with a digital-based system, but what it would never be is dangerous, because everything that the railway has to operate to what's called fail-safe. If it fails, everything has to be safe. So that's why if the signal wire breaks on a semaphore signal, if it breaks, the signal arm will always go to danger. And that's a simple demonstration. So the railways have always adopted the fail-safe approach to everything. And we are seeing, are we not, infrequent attacks on our national digital infrastructure anyway by state and non-state actors who are external to the country. And railways may well be a target, I agree. But that's not just germane to railways. That's germane to the entire extent to which UK PLC and the world PLC is now totally and utterly reliant on these things. And we all saw what happened with Spain when it all went down and the world ground to a halt. We may in the future have to get better at reverting to what I call the sort of steam-powered system, to coin the phrase.
Thank you. And we have time for one quick fire, maybe 2 very quick questions. If we come here, and then we'll come here before we wrap up.
Thank you very much. This is a question for Steve. Thinking to the future of Heritage Railway, and the preservation, but also the human experience of these engines, what's happening in Heritage Railway around a future without coal?
It's a very good question. Interestingly, Locomotion No. 1, the replica, we were struggling with because traditional coal was furring up the tubes because the insufficient draft up the chimney. We're now on this so-called eco coal, which to me looks like a barbecue briquette, but and that is actually working brilliantly because it's smokeless. But that stuff is not good for a mainline heritage locomotive. And as we speak, Tornado is hammering up Shap. I hope she's gone over Shap now. But these engines were built to burn coal of a certain quality at a certain temperature, and adapting them to oil firing and so on is difficult. The challenge is, I don't think the challenge is the supply of coal. Coal is always going to be available. I personally think it's an insanity that we are sat on a sea of the stuff and we have exported our carbon footprint to somebody else in order to burn their coal, which is lunacy in my opinion. So the supply of coal is not the issue. I think the threat to heritage steam will be a political one. There's coal everywhere, and in fact the world is burning coal at an increasingly fast rate. You know, we might believe that we are paragons of virtue in this respect, but others are less committed to that ideal. So I think that if there's a solution, it will be to lower carbon forms of coal. Believe it or not, there is a potential, particularly using coal dust to compress into briquettes. But on the main line, it could be oil firing. Last year, I was in the cab of an 012 Pacific out of Cuxhaven in Germany, and I was utterly astonished by how clean I was actually when I got off it. But it was a very efficient system, and that might be the direction of travel. What I hope is not lost sight of is two things. First of all, we have a tradition of heritage railways in this country, and a steam engine puts a smile on people's face in a way that a diesel or electric does not. And that's a feel-good factor. Secondly, the economic benefits of heritage railways, both in a mainline and heritage railway context, are significant. You just imagine if the North Yorkshire Moors Railway was told to start operating. I mean, the amount of people's employment up there, it's just absolutely central to it. So we've got to make sure there's a realistic, that all factors are taken into account here, not just fuel.
And I feel like I must add, as we're discussing fossil fuels, that LNER remains a sustainable and sensible way to travel when compared to travelling by car. But we at LNER in particular are very proud of our heritage, particularly in the year of Railway 200. We're equally interested to see how the heritage rail industry will fare in the future, particularly because, and I think this is a really important point to note, leisure travel accounts for one of the largest groups of customers we actually now move on LNER. So we've got time for one final question and then we will wrap up.
Well, sort of combination of the odd question and the odd bit of information which may be of interest. My question is, I've been watching, as I go past on the bus, the York Station Gateway project progressing, and I think it's an excellent scheme on the whole, but I'm very concerned that there's a rather ugly piece of stonework presumably from the part of the old Queen Street Bridge, which has just been left. Now, I'd like to know if that's is itself considered of archaeological interest and is to be retained, or whether it will be demolished in due course and something done to tidy up that area. But otherwise, I think it's an excellent scheme. I should very much hope the opportunity will be taken to clean the historic buildings around there, the station itself, that long extension of beyond the portico, and also the Railway Institute gym, because they're excellent buildings, but they'd look so much better if they were given a bit of a clean, and
Definitely.
Cleaning doesn't have to be by mechanical means these days. So that's just one point. The other point of sort of information which people may be interested to know is in the early 1970s, I've always had a bit of an interest in railways. And in the early 1970s, I was working briefly for York City Council, having just finished the conservation course at King's Manor. And I came across in a book by the American architectural historian Henry Russell Hitchcock the information that the old station at York contained the earliest railway hotel in the world. And I think it's probably not a fact that many people know about.
No.
And
we'll have to quickly wrap you up.
Yes, I decided on the basis that I ought to apply to the DOE for it to be listed, and it was listed from nothing to 2 stars straight off.
Well, thank you. So I'm going to quickly defer to Mary-Anne for a quick-fire response.
Yes, very quickly. So in terms of the archaeological importance, as I mentioned, so that part of the retaining wall was covered under our building recording. So it has been recorded from our point of view. I don't know actually what the plans are for it as part of the scheme. I don't know whether they need to keep it there for engineering purposes, where it butts up against the city walls, or whether it will be coming down. But yeah, I'm not sure on that.
Thank you. And just as we wrap up, a very quick one-line response from each of our panellists. In 200 years' time, when we've got another panel here celebrating Railways 400, what do you think they'll be thinking about the modern-day railway today in York? I know that was a big one to save until the end, wasn't it? But
I think they'd be surprised that people aren't making more use of the trains for leisure purposes instead of cars.
Quite. I don't know, Steve, Mary-Anne, if you've got any thoughts. What might they be discovering in 200 years' time? A pile of smartphones? We don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting. I mean, whether they'll... Yes, we've been hearing today about the sort of the changes in the technology on the railway, so whether there'll be anything that they'll start discovering from that, and the archaeologists in 200 years will be excavating railways of today.
Thank you. And Steve?
I don't think we'll be calling them railways. I think we might be calling them hover railways or lev railways, whatever, but I think in 200 years' time, the notion of steel wheels on rails will have gone, and other imaginative and novel ways of harnessing the law of physics to move people in vast distances. The routes of the railways may well have been adapted for that purpose, but I don't think we'll see a steel wheel on steel rails in 200 years' time, except on heritage railways still using
of course. But on that note, please join me in thanking the panel.